Hi, my name is Andrew Evans, and in this video, I will be continuing with my discussion of Derek Bolton's book, What is Mental Disorder? And in this video, I will be talking about chapter 5 of that book. So I really will zero in on just a few aspects of chapter 5 and some of the major conclusions of the book in general. The book does have a chapter 6, but that is sort of a summary type conclusion chapter. So I'm not going to make a separate video for chapter 6. Instead, I'm just going to sort of review some major conclusions here at the end of this video. The aspects of chapter 5 that I will focus on concern what Bolton has to say about psychiatry as a method of social control and as a method of managing risk in the community. This is mostly contained in sections 5.2 and 5.4 of chapter 5. Okay, so where is Bolton coming from? So we know from past videos on the Bolton book that he talks a lot about the anti-psychiatry movement. This is a symbol I found that apparently represents the anti-psychiatry movement, which was a movement that basically said that psychiatry is a method of social control. You're just pathologizing normal problems in living rather than real illnesses. And though Saz rejected the term anti-psychiatry, he was associated with this movement. He wrote a book called The Myth of Mental Illness and a paper with the same name. And here's a quote from him. He says, quote, "My aim in this essay is to raise the question, is there such a thing as mental illness, and to argue that there is not." So I think Bolton is trying to kind of still respond to these anti-psychiatry critiques, right? Is mental health care a method of social control? And what can we do about potential abuses of power? So Bolton starts this section by saying, quote, section 5.2. He says, quote, "Confinement in the asylums was a clear expression of the problem identified by Foucault and other commentators on psychiatry in the 1960s, the tendency for psychiatry to become or to be used as a form of social control of deviant behavior." So Foucault is also associated with anti-psychiatry, and that's kind of the person that Bolton focuses on most here in this chapter. So he's noting that confinement in asylum is a specific symptom of maybe mental health care being a method of social control. And, this is something that is common. It's a common critique up until today. Um, you know, what role, if any, mental health care should play in safety and what the bar should be, if any, for holding someone involuntarily in a psychiatric hospital. And we talked about the experiences of Ellen Sachs in past videos. So here's a quote from her memoir when she was detained against her will in a psychiatric hospital. Quote, okay, Dr. Griffiths said, motioning for the enforcer to step back. Just lie down then and we can talk. No restraints. A wave of relief came over me and I sagged back on the bed, thinking only of getting my head on the pillow, at which point everyone in this room did exactly as the others had done in the hospital emergency room. In seconds, my arms and legs were grabbed, pinned, and bound to the bed by leather straps. Then it got worse. Since apparently binding my arms and legs wasn't enough, they arranged a net over me, an actual net, from the top of my neck to the bottom of my ankles, covering my legs, my torso, my chest. I can't breathe, I cried. Yes, you can, and the voices in unison. I later learned that 100 or so people die each year in the US while being put in or kept in restraints. So Sachs is a professor at University of Southern California, and she's also been diagnosed with schizophrenia. She's had different experiences like this of being involuntarily restrained in psychiatric institutions, and she speaks out against it. So this is the sort of thing I think that Bolton is worried about, right? These psychiatric abuses of power, being held in an asylum against your will. Other critiques have come from the Mad Pride movement. So I don't want to conflate the writings of Ellen Sachs and Mad Pride and anti-psychiatry. I think these are all different things with different perspectives. But the Mad Pride movement is similar in that it is a critique of establishment psychiatry. It thinks of, and it's a diverse group and a diverse movement, but it thinks of madness as something to be, and that's a word that's been reclaimed in this group, madness is something to be celebrated rather than pathologized and controlled. Okay, so what does Bolton think can be done to prevent these sort of abuses of power? He says, quote, "So far as I can see, the move here, the one consistent with the direction taken in this essay, has to be like this. Prevention of the social abuse of psychiatry cannot be located in the difference between mental illness and social deviance, but has to be located in law, specifically in human rights legislation. What stops abuse in practice are the checks and balances of power, human rights legislation, courageous and persistent lawyers, courts independent of executive control, free intellectual life and universities, investigative journalists and free press, and so forth. In brief, all the apparatus of political democracy." So what is Bolton saying here? Much of his book has been trying to figure out what is a mental disorder, distinguishing, as he says, between mental illness and social deviance. And it gets very complicated throughout the course of the book. He kind of thinks that that question isn't that relevant to psychiatric abuses of power. He thinks that no matter what theory of mental disorder we have, groups that are in power that want to oppress people that struggle with mental health problems will do so. So really what we want is this sort of democratic checks and balances. He thinks that this is a way that abuses can be lessened or prevented, right? He thinks that it's ultimately a matter of government and the people who are in power to make sure these things don't happen. Okay, moving on to section 5.4. Here, Bolton discusses a similar issue. What role should mental health care play in the management of risk in the community? So he says, quote, "The picture shifts and is complicated when behavior brings risks of harm to the family or when disorderly behavior spills onto the streets, as, for example, apparently threatening behavior that may occur sometimes in psychotic conditions or antisocial behavior characteristic of conduct disorder or antisocial personality disorder." So what Bolton is wondering here is, does mental health care have a role to play in public safety? There are certain conditions that might be associated with risk to the community. Does mental health care have a role to play here? Now, of course, it should be mentioned that people with mental health conditions are in general more at risk of violence and danger than at being dangerous themselves, right? It's a misconception that people with mental health conditions are in general more dangerous. But he is noting that in certain cases, certain conditions might make individuals temporarily dangerous or violent, either to themselves or others. So what role might mental health care play in safety? Okay, so he asks this question, and here's his answer. Quote, "The issues here have similarities to those considered above in section 5.2 in relation to the political abuses of psychiatry. In that context, the main point was that psychiatric detention of people without conviction for a crime is prevented by the apparatus of democracy, rather than by having a clear line between mental disorder and social deviance. Here the point is that if we do want in democracy to detain people without conviction for a crime on grounds of risk to public safety, then the primary responsibility for this lies with political institutions and officials, subject to democratic checks and balances. In these complex matters of protecting the public, psychiatry no doubt has a role, but not as lead." So again, he's saying that, deciding what a real mental disorder isn't going to really help us here. What we need are laws that protect against abuses. And so maybe there is some role to hold people against their will if there is a risk to the community, but that's more of a government question. And psychiatry might play a role, but really political institutions and officials have to play the leading role here. That's Bolton's perspective. So what do you think of Bolton's conclusions here? Do you think he has it right that that's ultimately where we have to look for, taking the lead in these situations, that it's more about governments and democracy than it is about mental health, officials making decisions and defining mental disorder? Or do you think this is maybe somewhat of a naive conclusion? Do you think that, maybe we can't trust the government to make these sorts of decisions? So maybe take a moment to just think through, what do you think of Bolton's conclusions here to these critiques that have been raised against mental health care? Okay, I'm just going to end with a brief summary of some of the main points I think we can get from this book. So like I said, I'm not going to do a video on chapter 6, which is the conclusion chapter. Instead, I'm just going to kind of give some overarching themes that I take away from the book in general. So the book sought to figure out how we can distinguish between mental disorder and order, between mental abnormality and normality. And the conclusion seems to be it's complicated. Right. Bolton pursues lots of different lines of inquiry here and gets into a lot of interesting discussions, but doesn't come to a really simple answer, right? It seems to be a very complicated question with complicated solutions. Naturalistic definitions of mental disorder ultimately fail, according to Bolton, so he pursues a non-naturalistic approach grounded in harm, social norms, and the need to treat. And this was discussed in detail in other videos. He takes a more harm-based, non-naturalistic approach, more similar to what the DSM does, in his opinion. But even with this solution, there are many questions that are still open, right? How do we prevent psychiatric abuses of power? That's the question of this video. Is mental disorder even a good term for the conditions that mental health care ought to treat? That's another thing Bolton considers, and he seems to be skeptical that we can even have this term mental disorder that really captures all the conditions that mental health care ought to treat. So there's a lot of open questions and complications that he leaves us with, but I do think this is a really valuable book to kind of go through these different issues and come to some conclusions along the way. Well, thanks so much for, if you watched all the videos on the Bolton book, thanks for watching. I really enjoyed making them. And that's all I have for this book and for this video. Thanks for watching.